Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Bubbles and Splash. It is so good to have you here with us. If you're returning again, you've seen us lots of times, welcome back. If you're here for the first time, welcome for your first time. My name's Helen, and every week we have a story, a craft and a song for you to have lots of fun with. And if you want to go back and you want to see the ones we've done in previous weeks so you can catch up on our stories, you can do that on our YouTube channel at Christchurch Pennington. Now, over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about Moses, haven't we? We talked about Moses when he was born and how he was hid in the bulrushes. And then we talked about Moses when he saw a burning bush and how God gave him a message and a task to do. And last week, we found out what happened when he went and did that task. And he went and asked Pharaoh to let the people go. And God sent loads of plagues to try and show Pharaoh that he had to let the people go. There were frogs and there were boils. They turned the river to blood. There was hailstorms. It was horrific. But God hardened Pharaoh's heart and he said, I will not let your people go. And so last week I ended by telling you there was a secret 10th plague. Well, it's not that secret really. It was secret from you last week. But today we're going to hear about our 10th plague and what happened next and whether Pharaoh really did let the people go. So let's start then with our 10th plague. Now, you'll remember that Pharaoh had said, I will let you go, but I won't let you take your flocks. And Moses had said, no, that is not good enough. We all have to go. If you don't let us all go, none of us go. And Pharaoh had said, no, I am not letting you go. Do not come back and see me. And so God had said to Moses, right, okay, well, this is my last plague, my last plan. And this one, Pharaoh will let you go from. So God said to Moses, this is the plan. What is going to happen is that a spirit is going to pass over all of Egypt and all the firstborn sons. So if you're the first son who was born to your mum and dad, that was you, all of those Egyptian firstborn sons were going to die. And that included the people, the flocks and the herds and the cattle. All the firstborn sons, all the firstborn males would die. But the Israelite firstborn, so the people who Moses was trying to let go, their children, the firstborns of those, would not die. They would be fine. Because God only wanted to show the Egyptians that that Pharaoh needed to let the people go. So he said, that's my plan. So what you need to do is you need to tell the people they need to, on the 10th day, they need to go and find a lamb. And what they need to do is they need to kill that lamb a couple of days later. And the blood from that lamb they need to paint on their door frames. And that will indicate that that house is not to be touched, that nobody is to be killed in that house. And then they're to eat the lamb for their tea. They've got to cook it and roast it up and eat it and enjoy it and eat as much of it as they can. And whatever is left over, then that has to be burnt. You mustn't keep it to the next day. And the other rule is that while they're eating that meal, they have to have their coats on and their shoes on because they have to be ready to go. So Moses was like, right, okay. So he went and he started gathering the Israelite people and telling them what they had to do. And it took a few days. So eventually the 10th day came and everybody had their lambs. And they all killed their lambs on the 10th day. And they took the blood and they painted it on their door frames, on the tops and on this side and on that side, so that it was really obvious to the spirit when it passed over that they were a protected house. Their people would not be killed. And then they took their lamb and they roasted it over their fires and they had a really, really nice meal. But what did they remember to do? They remembered to put their coats on and their shoes on because God was going to get them out of this country. And so that night, while they were all sleeping, the spirit passed over and did what it was supposed to do. And Pharaoh was woken up with the news that his firstborn son had died. And he was angry. And the news came to him that other firstborn sons had died, and some of the flocks had died, and some of the herds had died, and some of the cattle had died as well. And he knew this was Moses and this was God. And so he demanded that Moses and Aaron be brought before him in the middle of the night. So Moses and Aaron came along, and Pharaoh was angry, and he said, this is of your doing. You and your people, go, get out, go while you can. And so Moses and Aaron, they hurried back to the Israelites and said, right, come on. Now remember, they all had their coats and their shoes on. They said, come on, let's go. Pharaoh has said we can go. We must go now. We have to go now while he still is saying we can go. So they took their men and their women and their children and their sheep and their cattle and everything else that they had, whoever it was, and they hurried off into the night. And you know what? There were so many of them. There were 600,000 people. Now that is just so many people. I can't even tell you how many people that is. That is loads. That is more than fits in the stadium at Leigh Sports Village. That is more than fits at Old Trafford, Manchester United's ground. That is like, I think, probably about 7 or 8 times the people that live in Leigh. It's just so many people. 600,000. And all their cattle. And so they were a big group of people trying to get out of Egypt. And so God, he was showing them the way. He would put, at night time, he would put a pillar of fire in the sky so they could see which way they were supposed to go. And during the day, he would turn that pillar of fire into a pillar of cloud that went up into the sky, and they would follow that so that they knew which way to go and to get out of Egypt. And they were hurrying along. And one of the reasons they were hurrying along is because they didn't trust Pharaoh. And you know what? They were right not to trust Pharaoh, because Pharaoh, after a short while, changed his mind. He realised what he'd done, because he realised that all these 600,000 people, they were the people that did all the building of the pyramids and expanding his city and did all the work for him. So suddenly he had nobody to do all that work. And he called his soldiers to him and he said, we're going after them. We're going to go and we're going to chase them and we're going to catch them up and we're going to bring them back. So he called for his chariot and he called for his horses and his armour, and he put it all on, and him and his men hurried off to go and get the Israelites back. Now, by now, the Israelites, they had made their way out of Egypt and they had reached a place called the Red Sea. Now, it's not actually a sea that's red. It's just a blue sea like anybody else, but its name is the Red Sea. And they got there, and they got wind in the distance of the fact that Pharaoh and his men were beginning to chase after them. And began to panic and were like, what do we do? How do we get across the sea? We haven't got any boats. And Moses said to God, surely you haven't brought us here just for Pharaoh to catch us. And God said to Moses, I'm going to tell you what to do. You need to hold your hands up and hold your staff up over the sea, and I'll make you a way through. Now, in the meantime, the Egyptians, Pharaoh and his men, they're beginning to catch up. And so the people are beginning to panic and wonder what's going to happen. And so God takes that pillar of cloud that had been the thing that they were following to get them out of Egypt. He took that pillar of cloud and he moved it and he put it in between the Israelites on this side and the Pharaoh and the Egyptians on the other, so that Pharaoh and the Egyptians couldn't really see where they were going, and they got a bit confused and a bit muddled and ended up going around in circles, a bit like being in thick fog. And so it held them up while God sorted out what was going to happen for the Israelites. And so back we are on the riverbed, and Moses has now got his hands up and his staff in his hand. And as he did that, God did something amazing. God caused a wind to blow, a mighty wind. And this wind blew and blew. And as the people watched, as Moses held his staff up and God's wind blew, the sea did something miraculous, something absolutely amazing. It began to just move apart like this, in a way that the sea never really does. And it began to move apart and make a pathway through the sea. And God said, I'm going to hold the water back. Now you can see like the fish in the sea, they would cut to the end and then they had nowhere to go. And you could see the waves, the water was just a big wall on either side, like nothing you've ever seen. And God said, right, you need to go through that path. I will hold the water back while you go through. Walk through, run through, get through as fast as you can. So God's holding back the Egyptians with the pillar of cloud, and then he's holding back the water as well for the Israelites to walk through. So the Israelites, all 600,000 of them, start walking and running and going through this pathway through the sea. And it must have been a sight. I mean, can you imagine looking up and seeing the fish and the water and thinking, oh my goodness, this never happens. This is amazing. And so all the people walked through, and as they got through to the other end, the Egyptians had managed to get through the fog and the cloud and had started to come through the pathway as well. So God said to Moses, once the last Israelite person was out of the pathway, he said, right, you stand up on this side and you hold up your staff again. And when he did that, God caused the waters, the walls of water, to crash back in as to how they had been as a sea. And all of the Egyptian soldiers and their horses and their chariots were washed around in the water and they drowned. And the people saw this from the other bank and they knew they were safe and they knew they could carry on their journey. Pharaoh was raging over on the other riverbank. But the people of Israel, Moses' people, had been freed from Egypt, and they knew that they could now continue on their journey to find the promised land. God had saved them from Pharaoh. He had got them out of Egypt, and then he had saved them and got them through the waters of the Red Sea and onto the other side safely. And so it's another story of what happened next, which we might find out next week. But they were rescued and they were free from Egypt and from captivity and from being slaves. And they were a happy people and they praised God and they thanked him for what he had done for them. And that's the end of that story for now. There's loads more that happens to those people. They have a really exciting adventure, but we'll find out about that another time. So now we're going to do our craft. So let's head next door into the kitchen and we'll see what's laying ahead for you this week.